Devoid Wrestling Podcast. Devoid Wrestling Podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Devoid Wrestling Podcast. I am here with a very special guest, the voice of British independent wrestling, Dave Bradshaw.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, it's we were just saying before we started recording that the lockdown is starting to drag now. It's I don't know when this is going out, but we're recording this late February, so we're almost the year anniversary now when everything went wrong. But hopefully we're headed towards the exit now.
Yeah, I think we're on an upward incline right now.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Because I mean, I haven't had any shows to do for quite a long time. Nothing live, at least. So it's been a rough year. But obviously, lots of people have had it far worse. But I think the independent scene's been hit pretty hard, and we could all do with getting live events back and getting fans back in arenas, and that's the goal at some point this year.
Yeah. Have you been contacted by any promotions about this is estimated timetable of when we think we're allowed to come back?
Yeah. I mean, I'm fortunate that I work for several in the UK and then a few overseas as well. So we've had, the companies I do for Germany and Hungary have had a couple of shows, because in August and September last year, the lockdowns got lifted sufficiently over in those countries that they were allowed to do live shows with limited audiences. So I've had a few shows to do in post-production that I've just done from my apartment afterwards. So there's that, and then there's been really nothing in the UK except obviously NXT UK is running. Progress has just restarted, and there's been, I think, Rev Pro done a little bit, ICW are doing a little bit. So some of the really big independents are doing stuff, but none of the sort of small ones that rely on audiences for their revenue have been able to do that. So it's I keep on getting calls. I keep on getting from the people I work with saying, "Oh yeah, we're planning to do." Like in April last year, it was, "Oh yeah, we're planning to do July, or we're planning to do September," and then because no one knew. People forget. I think that in March last year, certainly here, when the lockdown started, everyone was kind of under the assumption, this will be done in 8 weeks. And here we are a year later and we're still not done. So it keeps on getting pushed back, and it's a really uncertain time. And especially in Britain, actually, because the independent scene here, as you know, has been really thriving over the past few years. And so as a result of that, quite a few wrestlers in particular quit full-time jobs because they were able to sustain themselves on a full-time wage from wrestling, and that's all just totally collapsed overnight with the pandemic. Now some have been signed to NXT or to wherever, or AEW or elsewhere, so that's great. But for those who were maybe just on the cusp and haven't quite got to the point of being signed yet, but were doing wrestling full-time, it's been an incredibly difficult year.
Yeah, do you think that independent shows will just kind of have a fresh slate with storylines and stuff, or do you think there will be sort of a continuation, but maybe a recap of previous?
I think a lot of places will have to pretty much reset, because I think there's, for various different reasons with different promotions, the personnel has changed a lot. So there are places where their top stars, maybe in the year that just happened, have been signed by NXT UK, and so they've maybe lost their champion or someone. And you've got others where, I don't know, the pandemic has caused lots of people to reassess their priorities. I know a few guys who've decided they're not going to wrestle anymore. So, and then there was all the stuff with the speaking out scandal that happened here in British wrestling last summer as well. So that's changed a lot. I mean, I think it's changed things for the better in the long run, but it's no doubt it's changed who is in those top positions. So I think it's kind of going to be, for all of those reasons, it's going to be a real kind of reset when we are able to have multiple promotions running again. But I see it as an opportunity for young talent who want to be, whether they want to be signed, or whether they want to go to Japan, whether they want to, whatever their goals are in wrestling, the independent scene in Britain and in Europe is still large enough, and there's still enough of an appetite for it that there's now lots of open spots left by all of those people who've left those promotions for whatever reason. So it's a exciting time for those who are able to be patient, because when everything comes back, there will be, top spots there for the taking for those who are talented enough.
Yeah. So like in recent years, like the independent scene, especially in like Britain, like the past like 4 or 5 years, has really been booming. And like there's kind of like this ebb and flow where like it does so well that a lot of its top stars get signed, and so new people become the top stars and those people get signed. Do you think that independent wrestling as kind of a whole in that kind of way is designed for that, for those guys to just get signed?
I think that's a good question, and I think it's an open question still. Actually, if you think about it, in terms of how long British wrestling had been in that space with NXT UK, we had WRS wrestling on ITV on one of our main networks here. We're also signing guys for a while. So we've only really been in that position since kind of 2018, really, where the model on which the industry works is that there's lots of small independents, then there's a few large independents, several of whom have relationships with WWE or with New Japan or with someone, and then there's obviously NXT UK. So that kind of hierarchy, if you like, within the scene is something that didn't exist before 2018. And I think in maybe March 2020, when everything then stopped, the scene was still in the process of working out what the new, I hate to use this phrase that's been used in the pandemic a lot, but what the new normal looked like. So it's going to be how that will work, because some people have been predicting it's really bad for smaller independents, that lots of these independent companies in the UK would go bankrupt because now WWE is taking a more active role in the British scene. Others have said, no, it's great for independent talent, because as you said, there'll be that conveyor belt. Some people get signed, but that opens up spots for new people. So I don't know who's right. I don't think we'd figured it out yet. I think we were still learning what that was going to be, and then everything changed. So we still don't know.
Because it's the independent, like the way that it works, at least to me, is kind of like an unintentional feeder, as in like you like get like, let's say ICW for an example, like you get really big in ICW, and then like Triple H calls you, and then you're just like, do I stay in ICW where I can be the top star, or do I go to NXT or NXT UK where I'm probably lower on the card, and I will not, people won't know who I am, but I'll have a bigger I'll have a bigger audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think ICW is an interesting case, because they're one of the companies that do have that relationship with WWE, and their stuff is going on the network. So the people who are like starring for ICW or for Progress or for WXW in Germany or for any of the companies that have a relationship with WWE, once you're on those rosters, arguably, it's not that you've made it, but you're getting the exposure that you'd like to be getting anyway, right? Because you're on the network, you're getting eyes on you, and so you hope at that point, I think, that you'll get noticed, and if good enough, hopefully someone will want to take you to the next level. So it's not, what I'm trying to say, I guess, is it's not ICW and Progress and those guys who I would necessarily be worried about, because they're the ones who have been able to continue functioning through the pandemic, right? They're the ones who have been producing content for the network throughout this past year. It's that next tier down of independent promotions who are truly completely independent, don't have any relationship with another company, really do live or die solely by whether they can get fans through the door watching their product. they don't even have a particularly strong on-demand service online yet because they're still early in their evolution. So it's those companies that we've already seen several disappear, not just because of the pandemic, but because of other economic circumstances over the past 2 or 3 years. And we'll probably see more. But what I think is the unknown, why I say it's a question that's still to be answered, is that we don't know what fills that void. So if several of those pre-existing independent promotions disappear, what happens next? Does anyone replace them, or does it just mean that NXT UK or New Japan or Progress, ICW become more and more dominant within the independent space in the UK? I don't think we know. I think I would say I would be cautiously excited about the prospects for the UK scene, but it's going to be very different, and we still don't know exactly how that pans out.
So when did you become like a wrestling fan as like an adult? Because as probably many of my friends, probably many of your friends, probably people all over the internet, you were like a fan as a kid, and there was a falling out period, and then like there was like a point in time where like you came back and you were like, this is it, like I am a fan again, and like I can't believe that time I missed.
Yeah, I never really had the falling out period, so I guess I'm maybe unusual in that way. But started watching when I was a kid in what you guys call elementary school when I was 8 years old, and this was at the height of the Hulk Ultimate Warrior, Macho Man Randy Savage era of WWF, and I never really left after that. You know, there was those few barren years people refer to in after that kind of Hulkamania boom, but before the Attitude Era started, sort of 94, 95, when people say the product wasn't as good as it had been and would become. But to me, as at that point, an 11-year-old, 12-year-old kid, I was super into it. Even then, even when most of my friends had moved on to the next big trend, you know, I was still watching as much WWF, as it was called then, as I could get my hands on. And I never left. So I was really excited when I was sort of, 15 and the Attitude Era happened and my friends started liking wrestling again. That was cool. Because then it wasn't just I had someone to talk to about it rather than me being the only person I knew who liked it. But no, for me, I never left.
Never left. So how did you get your start as a commentator?
Well, I did at university. I did student radio, so I was at university from 2002 to 2006 kind of time, and just kind of fell into doing radio stuff as like a student. The way student radio is run in the UK, it's like as a student organisation through the Students' Union. So it wasn't part of my academic course or anything. It was just something I was doing for fun on the side, doing like a 2-hour radio show that went out across the city where I was at uni every week. And then from there, I just developed experience as in broadcasting. You know, it's a good place to experiment, student radio, because if you're lucky, you get like 15 listeners. So like it's a cool place to make mistakes. And I no doubt I made many. But by the time you kind of emerge from that, you know a little bit more about broadcasting, but also what your kind of personality is going to be like as a broadcaster, and therefore where you would fit in some other related industry, whether you want to go work in television or whether you want to go and I don't know, whatever else you want to do. And obviously I decided I wanted to use the skills I'd learned in student radio to commentate wrestling. And so once I'd moved back to London after university, I contacted a couple of promotions nearby, and eventually one of them gave me an audition, and then I started.
Yeah, did you ever like as a kid like because I know I did this as a kid, like on video games or on like Raw, I would just like mute it and I would just like do the commentary myself. Did you ever do that?
I don't really remember ever wanting to be a commentator as a kid. Like it was because, like I say, I didn't go to university. Yeah, while I'm at uni, I'm going to do student radio or anything like that. It was just kind of the way I fell into doing that stuff was one of my roommates was doing it. And he said, "Oh, you want to come on my show one week? It's really fun." And I was like, "Yeah, cool." And then I really enjoyed it. And so I started getting really involved with the student station there. So yeah, it wasn't that I had any, if you'd asked me in the year 2000, a couple of years before I went to university, whether I would end up doing the sort of thing I've ended up doing, I would never have guessed. It wasn't this kind of thing I was expecting. But it's funny how life goes.
Yeah, because that's like one of like the booths at WrestleMania Access, I'm pretty sure, where you like do a commentary match, where like you commentate a match, and like that's like one of the appeals.
Yeah, I was at WrestleMania in 2001, so I was at Access. It was Houston that year, so I was at Access. It was the first time I ever went to a WrestleMania, and I think it was the first year I might be wrong, but I think it may have been the first year they had those commentary booths. But I didn't even do it then because there was a long line, and it was kind of like, it wasn't like I don't know. It wasn't something that was like a big priority for me. In fact, I briefly trained to be a wrestler in 2002 for about 6 weeks, and then decided that, given that I've never in any way been athletic or had any kind of gymnastic skill, that was probably a major error of judgment. But that was in my mind before being a commentator was. So it was kind of just a natural evolution of what I ended up doing while I was at university.
Yeah, I also did college radio, university radio, and I started because a friend asked me, "Hey, you want to be at my show? It's at 10 o'clock." And I said, "Oh no, that's so late." Yeah. And then we got our own show the next semester. And so I totally understand. It is like that kind of like anybody can listen. I hope I don't screw up.
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is that my degree was in politics, and I'm interested in politics as an observer, but I don't work in it or anything like that. And actually, the thing that got me a job out of university, because at the time, even though I started doing some wrestling stuff, the scene was really small in the UK back then. So that was kind of just a hobby. I mean, I got paid, but it was a hobby, really. But I started working in TV production when I came out of university, briefly, only for like a year. And that I got those gigs purely because I had student radio on my resume. So none of where I ended up going from university, both in terms of what I was doing in my spare time with wrestling commentating, what I was doing for a job, which was working in TV, none of that came as a result of the academics that I'd done at university. Everything came from the kind of extracurricular stuff that I'd done. So whenever people ask me now, because when I went to university here in the UK, it wasn't quite free, but it was almost free in terms of tuition, right? Whereas nowadays it's kind of gone up to almost US levels of expense to go to university. And if someone asks me, is it still worth it to go to university like you did 15 years ago, whatever it is now, almost 20, like I say, yeah, I mean, it's 100% worthwhile, but not depending on what you want to do. For me, it wasn't worthwhile, particularly in terms of academics, because I didn't really use the academics afterwards. It was really important in terms of developing like your social skills, because you obviously meet loads of new people and all that kind of stuff. And it helped me get my break in media. So it was worth it, but not for the academic reasons you'd expect.
Yeah. So do you have any pet peeves that like commentators do as a commentator yourself that you're just like, I can't stand that?
Yeah, loads. I mean, like everyone has their own style, right? Everyone has their own preferences. I sometimes think, for example, I know Michael Cole historically has got a lot of abuse from people for not knowing the names of any moves. Like how he just goes, "Oh, a big slam," it doesn't say the names. It's like, okay, well, I can see why that annoys people, but also the opposite of the spectrum is true as well. When you've got someone who's so interested in making you understand that they know that every single variation of suplex ever invented that they want to show off by telling you every time, it gets a little bit much, so there's but where's the happy medium there is a good question, and I guess it's a matter of taste. So everyone's got their things they like and dislike.
I guess saying that means Excalibur is the polar opposite of Michael Cole, who knows like every single.
I don't think Excalibur goes.
Maybe not that
to such an extreme. Like, yeah, I think he's obviously more inclined to call moves than not. I'm not saying don't call moves either. I'm just saying like I'm saying there's a limit to how much you should focus on just calling the moves, particularly as a play-by-play guy, and how much you should focus on telling a good story and all of that kind of stuff. But that's just personal taste. You know, people might disagree with that and think, no, I want to know the name of every move. And if that's what you want from a play-by-play commentator, then great. But you know, you need it changes who your favorite play-by-play guy would be, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on, because you had a great article in the Wrestle Talk magazine from the past month about LGBTQ representation in wrestling. Something that I didn't really realize until about when I was in college that like existed, because of how kind of numb I am to that, because living in the state that I do, gay marriage has been like a thing for almost all my life since 2004. And so like that's like that kind of like acceptance has kind of always been there. So I just kind of never realized, but like reading your article, do you think that it's still not a problem, but it's still an issue with major companies like representing LGBTQ people?
I think it's still a problem to some extent in society, and I think it's a problem in entertainment as a whole. Obviously, I write about wrestling, and so that's what I know. And no doubt, the history of how LGBTQ characters in wrestling have been portrayed is somewhat checkered, to put it mildly. But I don't think wrestling is unique in that way. I think through certainly through my developmental years, when I was trying to figure out my sexuality and all that kind of stuff, it was at a time when in wrestling and in entertainment in general, there was not a sufficiently broad spectrum of LGBTQ characters on television. And so if you were confused about your sexual identity or anything like that, then watching TV didn't help. You know what I mean? Because you didn't gain role models from it. You didn't learn that your sexuality can mean many different things, and it's only one part of your life, and it's not defined. It doesn't totally define every part of you, because all the characters you would see on TV, if they were gay or implied to be gay, then that would be like their defining feature, you know, and they would be really kind of stereotypically over the top about their gayness, if I can put it like that. And I think it's not that there's anything wrong with those characters per se. It's that to only have that kind of character and to not have any kind of broader range of characters who happen to be gay, but they're also doing this or this on television. Mm-hmm. I found that it was problematic for me growing up, and I'm sure it was for lots of other people.
Yeah, it kind of became like an archetype of like the gay character would be overly flamboyant and and overly emotional, and it became like it got into like the 2000s and like the I would say mid 2000s, right?
Yeah. What happened?
I was thinking like Friends and like syndicated shows.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't know if I could put a date on it. I mean, I think it's got gradually better over time. Like I was thinking recently, I'm an uncle nowadays. I have like a niece and nephew, and I kind of think if either of them in a few years' time are having to figure out things about their sexual identity, then I hope, and I'm fairly optimistic that it might be a little bit easier for their generation than it was, because I do think society and the entertainment industry and pro wrestling and all of those things have evolved quite a bit since kind of 2000 or the 90s or whenever, but there's still some way to go, obviously, but it's better than it was. Yeah.
The history of like LGBTQ representation of wrestling, it kind of started at least like mainstream with Gorgeous George.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Gorgeous George was really, quite aside from his implied sexuality, Gorgeous George was kind of a pioneer, because there wasn't really, before Gorgeous George, much in the way of kind of baby faces and heels in wrestling, as I understand it. It was very much kind of everyone was just in white trunks and white boots, or black trunks and black boots, wrestling each other in these kind of long, drawn-out matches that lasted an hour at a time. There was no pizzazz, there was no entrance music, any of that. Gorgeous George is the first person on record to have entrance music, for example. He used to enter to Pomp and Circumstance, the same tune that Randy Savage later famously used. And that was sort of revolutionary at the time, that a wrestler would have entrance music. So he was the first person to use kind of character to get heel heat, certainly on the American scene. And he chose to obviously use a sort of a character that was implied to be something less than macho, to be in order to get under the skin of the audience of the day. Now, whether he deserves criticism for that or not depends on your point of view about the context of the times. You could argue, well, a wrestling heel's job is to do whatever it takes to annoy the audience, and to try and make them get a reaction from people. Whether even in the 1950s, a wrestling heel has some responsibility in terms of what kind of messages they're sending out, it's an interesting debate. But that certainly was, he was the first kind of gay archetype, if you like, in pro wrestling characters.
Yeah, and then it kind of fades away a little bit after Gorgeous George into the newer generations. And then when would you say like that kind of archetype comes back?
I don't think it went away. I think there were maybe fewer names that were of historical note after that, because essentially what was happening was people doing the same kind of shtick. Gorgeous George created not only this kind of archetype of the effeminate type heel wrestler who maybe has perfume that they're spraying around, that the sort of thing that the model Rick Martel was doing that in the 80s and 90s, that kind of thing. But also sort of as a deviation from Gorgeous George, there was the sort of the self-obsessed, narcissistic kind of heel who wasn't necessarily implied to be gay, but had a mirror follow him around everywhere. So Shawn Michaels, when he started, Lex Luger, when he was being the narcissist in WWF in the early 90s, all of those kind of guys, arguably they all date back to Gorgeous George in terms of the characters they were. And so in terms of how those archetypes of characters evolved, they only really evolved when the wrestling business started to change. And that's probably when it became a bit more raunchy and a bit more risque, a bit more adult oriented content with the Attitude Era in the 90s.
Yeah, and that's when Goldust became a figure of note, and the androgyny and like the bizarre one. He kind of like broke barriers with that level, because like that level of character had never really existed.
Yeah, again, I mean, in some ways he's a repeat of what George and 100 other characters were doing, in that there was something about his persona, and they used words like flamboyant or bizarre, and what they really meant was, something less than masculine was what was implied, and that was being used to kind of draw that heel heat, that reaction from the crowd that you want. He maybe took it a little bit further in terms of his act, and they tried to add a bit of mystique there in terms of they were kind of questioning, is that how he really is, or is he playing mind games with his opponents and all that kind of stuff. So in an odd way, his character was sort of maybe a little bit more complex than some of the more basic gimmicks of the 1990s, but it's still, the problem with the Goldust gimmick, I think, is that it still sort of gave out the message that being anything other than a totally macho man was in some way freakish or in some way not right and worthy of being booed by an audience, and so it was still a character, at least in its first incarnation, where the fact of how he was as a persona was presented to the audience as a reason to boo him. By the way, I don't blame Dustin Reynolds for that. He was portraying a character he was asked to portray, but I do think it's still kind of an unfortunate choice of gimmick for someone.
Yeah, one of the more shocking moments in his career was the ending of his WrestleMania match with Rony Piper, where he's stripped down and it's ladies' undergarments.
It was like shocking, but it's kind of shocking, but not shocking at all. Because that kind of cliched, kind of cheap humor, where it's like, oh look, they stripped him down, and oh, he's wearing women's underwear. Is the sort of like level of humor that was, again, not just in wrestling, but in the entertainment industry as a whole, in sitcoms, in anything else. That was the sort of kind of quality of punchline that you got revolving around like gay characters in those days. So it was like, it was more, I mean, at the time I didn't think this because I was only 12, 13 years old and I wasn't really thinking about the characters on that kind of level. But you look back at it now and you just sort of think it's more of the same. It was a chance, I think, probably the Goldust character maybe, but certainly Billy and Chuck, which happened a few years later, which maybe we'll talk about, was a chance to do something different with a character who was implied to be LGBTQ, and it was a squandered opportunity, I think.
Yeah, Billy and Chuck got like mainstream attention, like national mainstream attention. They got GLAAD gave like an award to WWE for being progressive about it, and like that whole there was a New York Times article written about it, and it garnered some real attention from non-wrestling media.
Yeah, the GLAAD thing is interesting because GLAAD, I don't think, had really paid attention. I might be wrong, but my understanding of it is they hadn't really paid attention to the Chuck and Billy gimmick that had been presented on WWE television for that previous year. And then they just got word, essentially, that, WWE is planning on doing a gay wedding on network television. That sounds great and progressive, right? Let's support that. Seemed to be the extent of the thinking, and it if you knew anything about WWE's product at the time, the idea that was going to go down as planned was probably naive, and obviously the way it turned out was that they didn't go through with the wedding. They claimed that it was all a publicity stunt, or they thought it was, and that, oh no, we're totally straight. And so it was a chance to do something a little bit groundbreaking with a couple of characters there. But it was sort of like maybe it was always the plan, but as a viewer, it kind of felt like they thought about it and then backed off and were like, no, we're not going to risk it because what if our audience boos it? So if we're going to turn them babyface, which they were trying to do at the time, then we're going to clarify that they're straight. The same thing they did with Goldust the years before. When Goldust finally stopped being a character they wanted people to boo and started being one they wanted people to cheer, clarified that Marlena, his manager, wasn't just his director, his movie director, but oh no, she's my wife. No, we're in love and I'm straight, kind of thing. So it it was an opportunity to do something different, and it ended up just being another repeat of the same kind of tropes that have been wheeled out in terms of gay characters for several decades.
Yeah, and on the Raw side, Eric Bischoff just brought out two lesbians to kiss because they were SmackDown was getting that kind of attention, which was I'm pretty sure he was the heel manager at the time, so it was like the heel doing something.
Yeah, what happened was this was right after the first brand split, right? So earlier in 2002 was when Raw and SmackDown started having different rosters for the first time. And in terms of how it was presented on television, the general manager of Raw was Eric Bischoff, the general manager of SmackDown was Stephanie McMahon. And so and then there was supposedly in storyline this rivalry between the two brands as to who could put on the most exciting product every week. And so Eric Bischoff's character reacted to Stephanie presenting a gay wedding. It wasn't called a wedding, it was called a commitment ceremony or something, I think they called it. But, that's just a publicity stunt. And so if she's doing that, I'm going to put a publicity stunt on Raw tonight. And we're going to have, before this 2 hour, it was 2 hours back then, before this 2 hour show ends, we're going to have HLA, hot lesbian action, live here on Raw. And of course, so that then hooks certain demographic to watch it for the next 2 hours, intrigued as to what Bischoff's going to present. And then when it comes to it, it was two attractive women in the ring who he had stripped down, and they start making out with each other. And then immediately this big super heavyweight male tag team comes down, who were kind of Bischoff's henchmen, a team called 3 Minute Warning, and they just come and brutalize these two women, like power bombs, all sorts of things. And it was like fairly shocking angle. And but also it happened, I don't know, a week or less, or around a week before the Billy and Chuck wedding angle was supposed to happen. So once again, if you look at Glad or something, you would think, okay, watch Raw last week, because that might give you a clue as to whether this angle that they're doing on SmackDown is likely to end in a progressive way. But unfortunately, it seems like no one did, and I think they got kind of taken by surprise when things did not go the way they had been led to believe that they would.
So Chris Kanyon was I don't know if I want to say openly because I don't know the story that well, but he a character that was like presented to not be stereotypically masculine, and then wanted to do a character that was like LGBTQ positive, but WWE like rejected that, and then he kind of did that on the indies, and it kind of didn't work. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, Kanyon had a really interesting autobiography, actually, which came out in 2010, which was the same year where he tragically committed suicide later in the year. But he was clearly, at the time that the book was written, he had a ghostwriter and everything, but it was clearly in a moment of, he was in a relatively good space, I think it's fair to say, when the book was written, because it's fairly clear and gives a pretty decent account of his career. And he's someone who knew he was gay, he said, from a relatively young age, I think from being teenage, and spent most of his career trying to hide that fact, including when he was in WCW and all of that. And I think there were always rumors about him, apparently, because he just didn't seem as interested in girls as the rest of the roster when they were going out after shows or whatever. But by the time he got to WWE, according to his account, he wanted to try and be a bit more, I don't know if he wanted to fully come out as a character, as a person, but he wanted to portray a character that was going to do that. And according to him, he said that he pitched an LGBTQ character for himself that would have been less stereotypical and a bit more kind of forward thinking in terms of how it would be presented. And he says he was shot down with that suggestion, and then he thinks he was punished by an angle that happened on SmackDown later on, where he was made to dress as Boy George, the 80s, the famous like gay 80s singer, and kind of literally come out of a closet and get beaten up by the Undertaker in an in-ring segment. So, and then not that long after that, he got released from his contract. So his view of it, at least, the way he perceived his treatment, was that he was treated that way because he pitched a gay character, a more progressive gay character. Now, I think his case is complicated because he after his WWE career ended, he got diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which in hindsight, he'd clearly been suffering from for most of his adult life. So it's difficult to know how much of him getting released was because maybe his behavior was erratic or he was difficult to work with or whatever. It's really hard to know. I know, for example, before he ended up ending his own life, he went on radio, I think it was radio, to talk about his claims that he'd been released from his contract for pitching a gay character, and they had Ric Flair come on and be the opposing voice, saying, "No, that's not why you got released. You got released because you weren't talented enough to stay on the roster, and you were difficult, and you were all of those things." So, without being there, it's hard to know. It's hard to know exactly which parts of the story are true, but it's certainly true, based on his autobiography, that he felt he was discriminated against because he wanted to portray a more progressive gay character. And it's also true that he felt throughout his career, not just in WWE, but in WCW and elsewhere, that he couldn't come out, and that would have been detrimental to his career at that time.
Yeah, I was not old enough to remember any of these. I watched the Undertaker segment, and I was kind of like, "Oh, that's what they did with this guy."
Yeah, I'd never seen that. I don't remember watching that at the time. I think it probably was when I was at university, and I wasn't watching Raw and SmackDown every week because I didn't have cable TV there. So I don't remember seeing that particular angle at the time. It was only after I read about it years later in his autobiography that I went back and watched it, and it does come across as pretty shocking based on if you read his chapter about it and then watch it, then based on his account of it, it's pretty shocking. Again, I'm not qualified to say if there were like extenuating circumstances, but it's extenuating circumstances. It's still that angle on its own, regardless of the impact it had on him, was just another angle that was based on really kind of stereotypical gay jokes, and it certainly wasn't helpful to anyone. The extent to which it was harmful is up for debate, is what I'm saying, but it certainly doesn't help.
Mm-hmm. And now in like the current landscape, there's openly gay, lesbian, transgender wrestlers on like major platforms like AEW and WWE. That's like a step in the right direction. But do you think that there's obviously there's still waves to go, but do you think that wrestling is kind of surpassing entertainment in that aspect?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things I tried to say in the article in the magazine is that I don't think it's not meant to be a totally like a polemic against wrestling, because I think although the ways in which gay and LGBTQ characters have been presented throughout most of wrestling history has been fairly poor, the way that actual LGBTQ performers have been treated has, in some cases at least, arguably been ahead of other sports and other forms of entertainment. So the fact that Pat Patterson, who also has a very interesting autobiography, the fact that he felt pretty much accepted, he never was open, he never really kind of talked openly in the locker room in those days about what he was doing sexually or anything in the way that maybe the straight guys in the locker room probably boasted about their various antics in those days, but it was known. It was pretty much known what his sexual orientation was, and yet he didn't feel like that it didn't cause him to be ostracized. In fact, he felt that he was embraced and was welcomed and found a home in the wrestling industry. So it's interesting. It's like, it's not a purely negative story. And clearly by 2013, when Darren Young came out, things had got to a point, or arguably maybe stayed at Patterson, where he was very much embraced by his peers. And so it's kind of a paradox, the wrestling industry, or its history at least, because in some ways the history is bad, in some ways the history is actually pretty good compared to other sports. You know, I think I say in the article, I certainly said in some interviews recently, that I doubt Pat Patterson would have found such a welcoming environment in an NFL locker room in those days, or a Major League Baseball locker room, or here in the UK in a Premier League soccer locker room. I find it crazy over here that there has still never really been a major Premier League soccer player who has been out while still playing. There's been a very small number who have come out after retiring, but still the perception here is that in the Premier League it would be really difficult in terms of how you would be taunted by opposition fans and all that kind of stuff for someone to be openly gay while an active player, and that's not true, at least in private, for some people in wrestling, for whom they've been able to do that for quite a while longer.
Yeah, Darren Young said that when he came out, he was like embraced by Triple H, and that Randy Orton came up to him and said, like, if anybody gives you trouble, you come to me. Which Randy Orton, being who he is, like, it's like a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really refreshing, and not just Triple H and Randy Orton. Apparently, Stephanie and Vince, I think, took 20 minutes out of his day, according to Darren Young, to talk to him about it that weekend, and it was SummerSlam weekend as well. It's not like it was a quiet weekend. So yeah, I think it's parts of the history, and certainly parts of the recent history, are kind of uplifting in terms of what it means for LGBTQ people. I just think that the way that colleagues, performers are treated behind the scenes versus how, at least historically, LGBTQ characters have been presented on television, there is quite a chasm between those two things. And certainly the portrayal of the characters is something that wrestling has needed to address for some time, and it's starting to get better.
Yeah, Nyla Rose, of course, being a transgender woman who won a world championship for a major promotion in 2020. That was pretty big.
Yeah, I think AEW, obviously they've only been around since 2019. I think they've had a pretty solid track record in how they've presented these things. They've been very clear and very vocal about the progressive kind of values that they want to represent as a company, and I think they're off to a really good start. I think WWE has been a lot better. There's several guys on the men and women and people of other genders as well on the roster, both NXT and on the main roster, who are now openly LGBTQ, which I don't think would have happened, well, didn't happen pre Darren Young. So yeah, there's clearly progress. There's still things to do. I think we're still not probably at a point where like an LGBTQ relationship would be part of a storyline in the way that a straight relationship might be. Not that that's necessarily a central part of pro wrestling. Wrestling is mostly about fighting, but
yeah.
you do get storyline, like romantic storylines between a man and a woman in pro wrestling. I don't think I have some doubts whether even now, nearly 20 years later, if a major wrestling company would have the guts to pull that trigger on a Chuck and Billy type storyline and say, no, these guys are gay, and that's who they are, and that's part of their character. We still haven't really seen that on a major wrestling platform, and I don't know if we're quite there yet.
Yeah, they a couple of years ago they kind of teased that with Mandy Rose and Sonya Deville for like 2 weeks, and then like they just completely ditched that storyline. But there's kind of that, and Paige kind of being bisexual kind of worked in storylines, like when she licked Natalia's face and like she was trying to be sexual in matches a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it gets implied. I mean, you can go earlier than that. You could go with Trish and Mickey James back in whenever that was, 2006,
7.
I don't know when it was. In mid 2000s. Mm-hmm. So there's hints at it. Right. Also, I think, by the way, the story of like female LGBTQ characters and male LGBTQ characters is different. I'm not saying one has had an easier time than the other, but they are presented differently. For example, the hot lesbian action angle you talked about on Raw in 2002 would never happen the other way, or in those days certainly wouldn't have. You wouldn't have had like two gay male characters making out in a ring as part of a wrestling storyline, in part because the idea was to attract this, Eric Bischoff was trying to attract this mostly teenage, mostly straight, mostly male audience, and by saying he's going to have two lesbians making out in the ring, they're hoping to pop a rating doing that, which is understandable because it's a business and that's what they're trying to do. But it's just it's difficult. I get that it's difficult, and I think it's still difficult now because wrestling companies, WWE or whoever, are still trying to appease their network partners as well. So it's not just about whether a wrestling company wants to put that kind of storyline out there and present those kind of characters out there. It's about whether USA Network or Fox or TNT or whoever it is going to be open to that kind of thing. If Vince McMahon or whoever else thinks, I'm not sure the network will go for this, then the safe thing to do is to always, other than just kind of implying what the character might be something other than straight. So it's going to take some boldness for people to take that next step. But there's progress. There is progress. That things are somewhat better than they have been in terms of how characters are represented now.
Hey, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dave. Where can we find you on social media?
You can find me everywhere. I'm on Twitter at Dave Bradshaw. I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Dave Bradshaw83. And my website is www.davebradshaw.tv.
Awesome. And before I let you go, I do have 2 questions for you that we ask every guest.
Okay.
So what are your opinions on the drink Sunny D, also known as Sunny Delight?
No, not really a fan. It tastes a bit I'm talking about the UK version, so I don't know what the US version is like, but the UK one tastes a bit chemically.
Then I guess it doesn't change over there, because same over here. We have a big war between me and my co-host. And do you think OJ did it? OJ
Simpson?
Yes.
I think my understanding is the evidence points that way. Well, I was only 12 at the time, so I'm not an expert on that case.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dave. And I'll see you all later.